Imagine a homeless teenager surviving on the streets of New York, only to rise through impossible odds and become the U.S. Surgeon General. This is the true story of Dr. Richard Carmona, a man whose resilience and determination changed his life forever. Richard Carmona was born into a world that offered little in terms of opportunity. Raised in an impoverished Hispanic family in New York City's Spanish Harlem, his childhood was far from easy. The streets were a harsh teacher, where violence, drugs, and crime were part of everyday life. With 5 siblings and barely enough food to go around, his family struggled to make ends meet. As a young boy, Richard quickly learned that survival was about adaptation and that life would not hand him anything without a fight. His parents, immigrants from Puerto Rico, worked low-wage jobs, often leaving Richard and his siblings unsupervised. His father, struggling with alcoholism, was not a figure of stability, and his mother, overworked and stressed, tried to hold the family together the best she could. But the weight of poverty was too heavy. In school, Richard was intelligent, but quickly became distracted. He excelled when he put his mind to it, but the temptations of the street were ever present. He was a boy with potential, yet surrounded by an environment that seemed determined to pull him down. As he entered his teenage years, he started skipping school more frequently, falling in with the wrong crowd. His grades suffered, and soon he dropped out of high school altogether. At just 16, Richard found himself without a place to call home. His family's instability had reached a breaking point, and Richard was forced onto the streets. With nowhere to go, he slept in abandoned buildings, under bridges, and on park benches. Each night was a gamble. Would he be able to find shelter, or would he have to face the bitter cold alone? Hunger became a constant companion. With no steady source of income, Richard scavenged for food, often going days without a proper meal. He would walk past storefronts, watching people eat, wondering if he would ever get the chance to live a life where he didn't have to worry about his next meal. Yet, in the depths of his hardship, Richard refused to give up. There was something inside him that pushed him forward. Even though he had dropped out of school, he still had the desire to learn, to rise above his circumstances. He watched the people around him, those who were caught in a cycle of poverty and despair, and promised himself that he wouldn't end up like them. But without a home or education, his future seemed uncertain at best. One night, after wandering the streets of New York for hours, Richard found himself standing outside a military recruitment office. The bright lights of the American flag hanging in the window called to him. He had heard about the military from a few of the older kids in his neighborhood, some of whom had joined to escape a life of crime or poverty. The military represented discipline, structure, and, most importantly, an escape. Richard walked in. At 17, with no high school diploma and barely any prospects, he wasn't sure if they would even consider him. But the recruiter looked at him, saw the determination in his eyes, and gave him a chance. After a brief interview and physical examination, Richard was accepted into the U.S. Army. It was a decision that would change his life forever. The Army provided Richard with the structure and discipline he so desperately needed. For the first time in his life, he had a roof over his head, food in his stomach, and a sense of purpose. But it wasn't easy. The physical training was grueling, and the mental discipline required was something Richard had never experienced before. Yet he thrived. His natural intelligence shone through, and he quickly rose through the ranks. It was in the Army that Richard realized he had a passion for medicine. While serving as a combat medic, he saw firsthand the importance of medical care, not only in saving lives on the battlefield, but also in transforming the lives of those who had no other access to health care. The seeds of his future career were planted during these years, but Richard's journey was far from over. Despite finding success in the Army, Richard knew that if he wanted to truly change his life, he needed an education. After earning his GED while in the service, he began thinking about the future. The military had given him stability, but he wanted more. He had tasted the possibilities of a better life, and now he craved knowledge. When Richard left the army, he faced another crossroads. Returning to civilian life wasn't easy. He didn't have the financial means to attend college, and the memories of his childhood struggles still haunted him. But Richard was no longer the same boy who had wandered the streets of New York. He was a man with a vision, a man determined to create a new path for himself. Through a combination of military benefits, scholarships, and part-time jobs, Richard enrolled in Bronx Community College. It was the first step toward his dream of becoming a doctor, but even then, his journey was fraught with challenges. Balancing schoolwork with the need to support himself was a constant struggle. There were nights when he wondered if he would make it through. As Richard Carmona began his studies at Bronx Community College, the weight of his past continued to linger. The streets, the hunger, the feeling of abandonment, they were all memories that fueled his ambition, but they also posed emotional challenges. Richard found himself juggling part-time jobs, long study hours, and the haunting fear of falling back into poverty. Many nights he'd study under the dim lights of the library, wondering if his hard work would truly pay off. Despite these struggles, Richard excelled academically. He was fascinated by medicine, driven by the knowledge he'd gained during his time in the Army as a medic. But medical school was a daunting and expensive prospect, and he knew that his journey would be far from straightforward. With no family financial support, Richard relied on scholarships, student loans, and continued part-time work. He often lived on the bare minimum, scraping by while focusing on his studies. Yet, his determination was unmatched. Professors noticed Richard's sharp mind and compassionate nature. He wasn't just a student striving for success. He was someone who genuinely cared about making a difference in the world. His experiences, both in poverty and on the battlefield, shaped his unique perspective on medicine. To Richard, being a doctor wasn't just about diagnosing illnesses, it was about understanding the human condition and offering hope to those who had none. After completing his undergraduate studies, Richard applied to medical school, a critical juncture in his life. The competition was fierce, and the costs were enormous. Yet, against all odds, he was accepted into the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF Medical School, one of the most prestigious medical programs in the country. The news was a validation of everything he had fought for, but the challenges were far from over. Medical school was an entirely new world. The rigorous demands of the coursework, the long hours in the hospital, and the emotional toll of working with patients pushed Richard to his limits. Many of his classmates came from privileged backgrounds, with supportive families and financial stability. Richard, on the other hand, was still working to make ends meet, living off student loans and part-time jobs. His upbringing had prepared him for hardship, but the mental and emotional pressure of medical school often left him feeling isolated. But Richard was no stranger to perseverance. He approached his studies with the same tenacity that had seen him through his days on the streets and in the military. Slowly, he began to distinguish himself, not just as a talented student, but as someone who could thrive in high-stress situations. His professors and peers began to see in him the makings of a great doctor. One defining moment came during a rotation in trauma surgery. Richard found his true calling in the fast-paced, high-stakes environment of the trauma ward. It reminded him of his days as a combat medic, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. He thrived under pressure, and his hands became steady as he performed intricate procedures. It was during these moments that Richard realized his potential as a trauma surgeon. After graduating from UCSF with a medical degree, Richard chose to specialize in trauma surgery. He completed his residency in surgery and critical care, becoming an expert in handling life-threatening injuries. His dedication, precision, and empathy for his patients set him apart. Despite all his successes, Richard never forgot where he came from. He knew that many of his patients, like him, had faced immense struggles, and he treated each one with the care and respect they deserved. Even as his professional career took off, Richard faced personal struggles. The pressure of his medical career, combined with the emotional toll of his past, made it difficult to maintain relationships and find balance in his life. He worked long hours, often at the expense of his own well-being. But Richard had always been a fighter, and through it all, he maintained his commitment to his patients and his sense of purpose. During this time, Richard also became involved in public health, advocating for underserved communities that lacked access to basic medical care. His background made him uniquely positioned to understand the struggles of the poor, the homeless, and the disadvantaged. He worked tirelessly to ensure that people from all walks of life received the care they needed, often volunteering his time in community clinics and outreach programs. In 2002, after years of distinguished service in both medicine and public health, Richard Carmona was appointed as the 17th Surgeon General of the United States by President George W. Bush. His appointment was a testament to his incredible journey, from a homeless boy on the streets of New York to one of the most respected medical professionals in the country. As Surgeon General, Richard used his platform to advocate for better health care, focusing on issues like childhood obesity, tobacco control, and emergency preparedness. He also worked to improve healthcare access for underserved communities, drawing on his own experiences growing up in poverty. His personal story inspired millions, and he became a symbol of what is possible when determination and compassion drive a person forward. Even after his term as Surgeon General ended, Richard continued to be a prominent voice in public health. He authored books, gave motivational speeches, and served as a professor, sharing his knowledge and experiences with the next generation of healthcare professionals. His life story, marked by resilience, dedication, and a deep commitment to serving others, became an inspiration to people across the world. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to subscribe for more real-life stories that move your heart. And tell us in the comments, what part of this journey inspired you the most?